Chinese tennis star Peng Shuai all but disappeared from the public eye after she accused Chinese Vice Premier Zhang Gaoli of sexual assault back in 2017. Peng was not seen or heard from since November 2nd after her account of assault was scrubbed from the Chinese social media platform. In the wake of her post, search terms for tennis were blocked out and info about Peng was absent from China's internet. And it's not only there. Rising regular Rachel Bovard points out our friends over at Breaking Points were demonetized for even covering the story here on YouTube. YouTube is, of course, owned by Google.
Over the weekend, the president of the International Olympic Committee allegedly held a video call with Peng where she told him she was safe and well and living in her home in Beijing, according to reports. Following skepticism over the video call, Peng appeared in public Sunday at a youth tennis tournament in Beijing, according to photos released by the Chinese state-affiliated media. But the World Tennis Association found the appearance to be insufficient. Calls to boycott the Olympics have flooded social media following her disappearance, and the Women's Professional Tour threatened to pull events out of China unless Peng's safety was assured.
And yesterday, CNN was blatantly censored in China for reporting on Peng's whereabouts. Let's watch that.
The WTA says they simply don't have evidence right now that Peng Shuai is not being silenced, that she is not able to speak freely. They say none of the proof that has been provided by Chinese state media, John, gives them any comfort that she's actually in a position where her interests are being best represented.
So, Will, I want to explain to our viewers what's happening on our screen right now, because underneath your face, they can see a box, which is the actual live feed of this broadcast in China, but it's all color bars. And it went to color bars the minute you started talking. So what's going on here?
Chinese censors, John. I have lost count over the last 8 years here in Asia covering China of how many times CNN's coverage of controversial issues has been censored. It used to go to straight black. Now they've upgraded and they go to color bars. But nonetheless, it is a live, real-time example of the censorship that's happening in the mainland.
China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said today that the Chinese government hopes, quote, malicious speculation over Peng would stop and that her case should not be politicized. He declined to comment on whether Peng's allegations of assault would be investigated and said Peng's situation was not a diplomatic issue. Team Rising joins us to discuss the saga. Democratic strategist Jennifer Holdsworth-Karp and Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard. Great to have you both back with us.
Good morning. Thank you.
So, Rachel, we'll start with you. As you wrote something about this and how our friends at former hosts of the show, right, Crystal and Sagar, had a video discussing this case. Can you talk a little bit about that and what happened?
Sure. Well, on Breaking Points, they discussed this issue of sexual assault, the claims that were made by Peng Shuai that resulted in her sudden, disappearance from the tennis scene, from the international scene. And as a result, YouTube demonetized the video, not meaning they took it down. The segment still plays, but no ads will be run on it. The host will make no money off of it, similar to kind of what happens here at Rising. But the explanation that YouTube eventually provided them was just kind of beyond the pale. Obviously, there was concern, that it was because they were criticizing China. YouTube said, no, it's just that we as a policy, we don't put out or monetize videos in which there's an allegation of sexual assault made between two people. And that itself is just ridiculous because, are they taking down videos about Harvey Weinstein? Are they going to not report or not run videos if someone accuses Donald Trump of sexual assault? Are they going to remove any coverage of Christine Blasey Ford's allegations against Brett Kavanaugh? I mean, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. And the point I made in the piece is that, even beyond this particular content moderation policy, YouTube has been busted again and again, and Google more broadly, deferring to China's censorship regime, deferring to their request to remove, videos about their human rights abuses. Google famously, as The Intercept reported a couple of years ago, tried to write a censored search engine for China. I mean, they want access to this market. So their financial incentive is to do exactly what China says. But the unfortunate side effect for us is that it curtails how we cover the news here in the United States, because YouTube, as we all know right now, is a primary platform for spreading news, for independent reporting. And China's influence here, I think, is very disturbing.
Right. And Jennifer and Rachel, I'd be curious for your take on this too, but does this also point toward a fundamental problem with a media platform like YouTube that it claims to be independent, and the idea around it is that it's a way to get around kind of the mainstream media, the corporate media, but it's funded by major corporations, and if major corporations A, don't want to offend countries like China, and B, don't want their kind of their image next to controversial subjects like, say, sexual assault allegations, and they say, well, we don't want our ads anywhere near that. Then the incentive for independent content creators, quote unquote independent, they're dependent on this ad revenue, is to avoid anything controversial like that, and just to talk about Roblox or opening your Christmas gifts or recipes or whatever other thing isn't going to be objectionable to any advertisers. So do you worry that this vision that we have for an independent media is actually kind of in the hands of still in the hands of corporations?
Unfortunately, yes. And this also goes to the question that conservatives, Republicans more broadly, have been grappling with in terms of censorship. Obviously, there is a fine line on the First Amendment about the restriction of content, but that only deals with government actors. And as of the moment, the way that the laws are written, YouTube is not technically a government actor, but there is an argument. I'm not sure if I sign up for it just yet, but it's something that I'm exploring in my writing, is are they big enough to act as a government actor, and should they be held to the same First Amendment standards that the U.S. government is, especially since they enjoy the protection of the U.S. government law. I think that 50,000-foot question is what is leading us to the question that we're dealing with today. There is no question that this is the wrong decision. I did see somewhere that the, as Rachel mentioned, explanation for the demonetization was around the word rape specifically in the title of that segment on Breaking Points. The explanation, which I don't think is sufficient by YouTube and Google more broadly, by the way, is that the word itself was extremely inflammatory. I mean, they could remove that from the title and see if that rings true. But it has been increasingly concerning that YouTube and Google more broadly has been deferring to Chinese censorship. And I think that it's something that Congress should get into.
Rachel, I know you agree with that. I don't quite agree. I'm not. I think, well, in some sense, getting the government more involved in like what YouTube's policy should be is like exactly what China does, right? It's the thing we're criticizing, is government control of the platform, is people needing the government's permission to make moderation decisions. But I was interested to see CNN taking seriously and talking about how China was treating their broadcast. I feel like China is there's a lot of criticism of censorship and authoritarianism about China in the kind of like right-leaning or right-wing media, but not exclusively. There are mainstream media criticisms of China as well. Do you think the mainstream media is doing a good enough job talking about the threat posed by China and how it is like a sham, a travesty that we're gonna have our own companies making censorship decisions to appease authoritarian foreign government?
I don't think that they're giving it enough due, and I think it's exactly the same reason that YouTube censored the video from Breaking Points, and that they're incentivized not to. I mean, they have a ton of corporate sponsors. They, want also access to the Chinese market. They're not going to criticize Nike. They're not going to go after Apple in the way that they may have otherwise, because of that incentive, not to. They want to make money from these advertisers, and so that I think speaks more broadly to the problem. But the promise of YouTube, and I think this is what makes this whole discussion, it just raises the stakes of it, because the promise of YouTube was to get around that. right? Like our mainstream and establishment media has always had these incentives. They've always been funded by these corporate advertisers. This is a known thing. YouTube presented itself as a way to get around that, to circumvent that, to get the best information and opinions and even news from alternative sources that weren't necessarily incentivized in the same way. But now YouTube is entrenching itself exactly like the corporate media. It's becoming very much of a corporate directed platform. And that sort of independent spirit and content creation is going out the window. And now to your point about sort of controlling, the content moderation, I also worry about the downstream effect of that, which is why, a lot of the work that I do actually focuses on breaking the scale at which these companies exist, right? If you have not just one mega platform like YouTube, but you actually have meaningful competition in this space, you don't just have to go to YouTube, you can go to other places. Now you have Rumble that's up and coming, but anyone who looks at the market economics of this knows YouTube, Google more broadly is so dominant in this space because of the sort of digital ad space, the data-driven policies around this. No one can catch them. So I do think that this space that YouTube entered into is valuable, and we should seek to preserve it by allowing more independent thinkers that aren't necessarily subject to the controls that YouTube now, honestly, almost as an establishment media source, is putting on its content creators.
Yeah, for sure. Rachel, Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And we will have more Rising right after this, and let's see if they demonetize this one.
Hope not.